Christendom has several meanings. In a cultural sense, it refers to the religion itself. In a contemporary sense, it may refer to the worldwide community of Christians, adherents of Christianity, or the collectively of Christian majority countries, or countries in which Christianity dominates, or nations in which Christianity is the established religion. In its historical sense, the term usually refers to the medieval and early modern period, during which the Christian world represented a geopolitical power juxtaposed with both the pagan and especially the Muslim world. In the traditional Roman Catholic sense of the word, it refers to the sum total of nations in which the Catholic Church is the established religion of the state, or which have ecclesiastical concordats with the Holy See. Terminology in usage. The term Christendom existed in Old English, but it had the sense now taken by Christianity. The current sense of the word of lands where Christianity is the dominant religion emerges in late Middle English. This semantic development happened independently in the languages of late medieval Europe, which leads to the confusing semantics of English Christendom equaling German Christenheit, French Chrétienté versus English Christianity equaling German Christentum, French Christianisme. The reason is the increasing fragmentation of Western Christianity at the time, both in theological and in political respect. Christendom as a geopolitical term is thus meaningful in the context of the Middle Ages, and arguably during the European Wars of Religion and the Ottoman Wars in Europe. The Christian world is also known collectively as the Corpus Christianum, translated as the Christian body, meaning the community of all Christians. The Christian polity, embodying a less secular meaning, can be compatible with the idea of both a religious and a temporal body, Corpus Christianum. The Corpus Christianum can be seen as a Christian equivalent of the Muslim Ummah. The word Christendom is also used with its other meaning to frame true Christianity. A more secular meaning can denote that the term Christendom refers to Christians considered as a group, the political Christian world, as an informal cultural hegemony that Christianity has traditionally enjoyed in the West. In its most broad term, it refers to the world's Christian majority countries, which share little in common aside from the predominance of the faith. Unlike the Muslim world, which has a geopolitical and cultural definition that provides a primary identifier for a large swath of the world, Christendom is more complex. It may be a cultural notion, but has very little weight in international discourse. Very few political observers really discuss Christendom, while the Muslim world tends to comprise a civilization in itself. For example, the Americas and Europe are considered part of Christendom, but this region is further subdivided into the West and Latin America. It is also less geographically cohesive than the Muslim world, which stretches almost continuously from North Africa to South Asia. There is a common and non-literal sense of the word that is much like the terms Western world, known world, or free world. When Thomas F. Connolly said, "There isn't enough power in all Christendom to make that airplane what we want," he was simply using a figure of speech, although it is true that during the Cold War, just as the totalitarianism of the communist bloc presented a contrast with the liberty of the free world, the state atheism of the communist bloc contrasted with religious freedom and powerful religious institutions in North America and Western Europe. History. Early Christendom. In the beginning of Christendom, early Christianity was a religion spread in the Greek, Roman world and beyond as a first-century Jewish sect, which historians refer to as Jewish Christianity. It may be divided into two distinct phases: the apostolic period, when the first apostles were alive and organizing the church, and the post-apostolic period, when an early episcopal structure developed, whereby bishoprics were governed by bishops. The post-apostolic period concerns the time roughly after the death of the apostles, when bishops emerged as overseers of urban Christian populations. The earliest recorded use of the terms Christianity and Catholic dates to this period, the 2nd century, attributed to Ignatius of Antioch c. 107. Early Christendom would close at the end of imperial persecution of Christians after the ascension of Constantine the Great and the Edict of Milan in AD 313 and the First Council of Nicaea in 325. Late Antiquity and Early Middle Ages Christendom has referred to the medieval and Renaissance notion of the Christian world as a socio-political polity. In essence, the earliest vision of Christendom was a vision of a Christian theocracy, a government founded upon and upholding Christian values, whose institutions are spread through and over with Christian doctrine. In this period, members of the Christian clergy wield political authority. The specific relationship between the political leaders and the clergy varied, but, in theory, the national and political divisions were at times subsumed under the leadership of the Church as an institution. This model of church-state relations was accepted by various church leaders and political leaders in European history. The Church gradually became a defining institution of the empire. Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313 proclaiming toleration for the Christian religion, and convoked the First Council of Nicaea in 325, whose Nicene Creed included belief in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Emperor Theodosius I made Nicene Christianity the state church of the Roman Empire with the Edict of Thessalonica of 380. As the Western Roman Empire disintegrated into feudal kingdoms and principalities, the concept of Christendom changed as the Western Church became one of 5 patriarchal of the Pentarchy and the Christians of the Eastern Roman Empire developed. The Byzantine Empire was the last bastion of Christendom. Christendom would take a turn with the rise of the Franks, a Germanic tribe who converted to the Christian faith and entered into communion with Rome. On Christmas Day 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne, resulting in the creation of another Christian king beside the Christian emperor in the Byzantine state. The Carolingian Empire created a definition of Christendom in juxtaposition with the Byzantine Empire, that of a distributed versus centralized culture respectively. The classical heritage flourished throughout the Middle Ages in both the Byzantine Greek East and the Latin West. In the Greek philosopher Plato's ideal state there are 3 major classes, which was representative of the idea of the tripartite soul, which is expressive of 3 functions or capacities of the human soul: reason, the spirited element, and appetites. Durant made a convincing case that certain prominent features of Plato's ideal community were discernible in the organization, dogma and effectiveness of the medieval church in Europe. For 1,000 years Europe was ruled by an order of guardians considerably like that which was visioned by our philosopher. During the Middle Ages it was customary to classify the population of Christendom into laborators, bellators, and orators. The last group, though small in number, monopolized the instruments and opportunities of culture, and ruled with almost unlimited sway half of the most powerful continent on the globe. The clergy, like Plato's guardians, were placed in authority by their talent as shown in ecclesiastical studies and administration, by the disposition to a life of meditation and simplicity, and by the influence of the relatives with the powers of state and church. In the latter half of the period in which they ruled, the clergy were as free from family cares as even Plato could desire. Celibacy was part of the psychological structure fracture of the power of the clergy, for on the one hand they were unimpeded by the narrowing egoism of the family, and on the other their apparent superiority to the call of the flesh added to the awe in which lay sinners held them. In the latter half of the period in which they ruled, the clergy were as free from family cares as even Plato could desire. Later Middle Ages and Renaissance. After the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, the southern remnants of the Holy Roman Empire became a collection of states loosely connected to the Holy See of Rome. Tensions between Pope Innocent III and secular rulers ran high, as the pontiff exerted control over the temporal counterparts in the West and vice versa. The pontificate of Innocent III is considered the height of temporal power of the papacy. The Corpus Christianum described the then current notion of the community of all Christians united under the Roman Catholic Church. The community was to be guided by Christian values in its politics, economics and social life. Its legal basis was the Corpus Iuris Canonica. In the East, Christendom became more defined as the Byzantine Empire's gradual loss of territory to an expanding Islam and the Muslim conquest of Persia. This caused Christianity to become important to the Byzantine identity. Before the East-West schism which divided the Church religiously, there had been the notion of a universal Christendom that included the East and the West. After the East-West schism, hopes of regaining religious unity with the West were ended by the Fourth Crusade, when Crusaders conquered the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and hastened the decline of the Byzantine Empire on the path to its destruction. With the breakup of the Byzantine Empire into individual nations with nationalist Orthodox churches, the term Christendom described Western Europe. Catholicism, Orthodox Byzantines, and other Eastern rites of the Church. The Catholic Church's peak of authority over all European Christians and the common endeavors of the Christian community, for example, the Crusades, the fight against the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula and against the Ottomans in the Balkans, helped to develop a sense of communal identity, against the obstacle of Europe's deep political divisions. But this authority was also sometimes abused, and fostered the Inquisition and anti-Jewish pogroms, to root out divergent elements and create a religiously uniform community. Ultimately, the Inquisition was done away with by order of Pope Innocent III. Christendom ultimately was led into a specific crisis in the late Middle Ages, when the kings of France managed to establish a French national church during the 14th century, and the papacy became ever more aligned with the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Known as the Western Schism, Western Christendom was a split between three men, who were driven by politics rather than any real theological disagreement for simultaneously claiming to be the true pope. The Avignon papacy developed a reputation of corruption that estranged major parts of Western Christendom. The Avignon schism was ended by the Council of Constance. Before the modern period, Christendom was in a general crisis at the time of the Renaissance popes because of the moral laxity of these pontiffs and the willingness to seek and rely on temporal power as secular rulers did. Many in the Catholic Church's hierarchy in the Renaissance became increasingly entangled with insatiable greed for material wealth and temporal power, which led to many reform movements, some merely wanting a moral reformation of the Church's clergy, while others repudiated the Church and separated from it in order to form new sects. The Italian Renaissance produced ideas or institutions by which men living in society could be held together in harmony. In the early 16th century, Baldassare Castiglione laid out his vision of the ideal gentleman and lady, while Machiavelli cast a jaundiced eye on La Verita Fidel del Cose, the actual truth of things, in the Prince composed humanist style, chiefly of parallel ancient and modern examples of virtue. Some Protestant movements grew up along lines of mysticism or Renaissance humanism. The Catholic Church fell partly into general neglect under the Renaissance popes, whose inability to govern the Church by showing personal example of high moral standards set the climate for what would ultimately become the Protestant Reformation. During the Renaissance, the papacy was mainly run by the wealthy families and also had strong secular interests. To safeguard Rome and the connected papal states, the popes became necessarily involved in temporal matters, even leading armies, as the great patron of arts Pope Julius II did. During these intermediate times, popes strove to make Rome the capital of Christendom while projecting it, through art, architecture, and literature, as the center of a golden age of unity, order, and peace. Professor Frederick J. McGinnis described Rome as essential in understanding the legacy the Church and its representatives encapsulated best by the Eternal City. No other city in Europe matches Rome in its traditions, history, legacies, and influence in the Western world. Rome in the Renaissance under the papacy not only acted as guardian and transmitter of these elements stemming from the Roman Empire but also assumed the role as artificer and interpreter of its myths and meanings for the peoples of Europe from the Middle Ages to modern times. Under the patronage of the popes, whose wealth and income were exceeded only by their ambitions, the city became a cultural center for master architects, sculptors, musicians, painters, and artisans of every kind. In its myth and message, Rome had become the sacred city of the popes, the prime symbol of a triumphant Catholicism, the center of Orthodox Christianity, a New Jerusalem. It is clearly noticeable that the popes of the Italian Renaissance have been subjected by many writers with an overly harsh tone. Pope Julius II, for example, was not only an effective secular leader in military affairs, a deviously effective politician, but foremost one of the greatest patron of the Renaissance period and person who also encouraged open criticism from noted humanists. The blossoming of Renaissance humanism was made very much possible due to the universality of the institutions of Catholic Church and represented by personalities such as Pope Pius II, Nicolaus Copernicus, Leon Battista Alberti, Desiderius or Erasmus, Sir Thomas More, Bartolomé de las Casas, Leonardo da Vinci and Teresa of Avila. George Santayana in his work The Life of Reason postulated the tenets of the all-encompassing order the Church had brought and as the repository of the legacy of classical antiquity. The enterprise of individuals or of small aristocratic bodies has meantime sown the world which we call civilized with some seeds and nuclei of order. There are scattered about a variety of churches, industries, academies, and governments, but the universal order once dreamt of and nominally almost established, the empire of universal peace, all-permeating rational art, and philosophical worship, is mentioned no more. An unformulated conception, the pre-rational ethics of private privilege and national unity, fills the background of men's minds. It represents feudal traditions rather than the tendency really involved in contemporary industry, science, or philanthropy. Those dark ages, from which our political practices derive, had a political theory which we should do well to study, for the theory about a universal empire and a Catholic Church was in turn the echo of a former age of reason, when a few men conscious of ruling the world had for a moment sought to survey it as a whole and to rule it justly. Reformation and early modern era developments in Western philosophy and European events brought change to the notion of the Corpus Christianum. The 100 Years' War accelerated the process of transforming France from a feudal monarchy to a centralized state. The rise of strong, centralized monarchies denoted the European transition from feudalism to capitalism. By the end of the 100 Years' War, both France and England were able to raise enough money through taxation to create independent standing armies. In the Wars of the Roses, Henry Tudor took the crown of England. His heir, the absolute King Henry VIII, establishing the English Church. In modern history, the Reformation and rise of modernity in the early 16th century entailed a change in the Corpus Christianum. In the Holy Roman Empire, the Peace of Augsburg of 1555 officially ended the idea among secular leaders that all Christians must be united under one church. The principle of quia regio, eius religio, established the religious, political and geographic divisions of Christianity, and this was established with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which legally ended the concept of a single Christian hegemony in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Despite the Catholic Church's doctrine that it alone is the one true church founded by Christ, subsequently, each government determined the religion of their own state. Christians living in states where their denomination was not the established one were guaranteed the right to practice the faith in public during allotted hours and in private at the will. The European wars of religion are usually taken to have ended with the Treaty of Westphalia, or arguably, including the 9 Years' War and the War of the Spanish Succession in this period, with the Treaty of Utrecht of 1713. In the 18th century, the focus shifts away from religious conflicts, either between Christian factions or against the external threat of Islam. The European miracle, the Age of Enlightenment and the formation of the great colonial empire together with the beginning decline of the Ottoman Empire mark the end of the geopolitical history of Christendom. Instead, the focus of Western history shifts to the development of the nation-state, accompanied by increasing atheism and secularism, culminating with the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars at the turn of the 19th century. Classical culture, art and literature, writings and poetry. Christian literature is writing that deals with Christian themes and incorporates the Christian worldview. This constitutes a huge body of extremely varied writing. Christian poetry is any poetry that contains Christian teachings, themes, or references. The influence of Christianity on poetry has been great in any area that Christianity has taken hold. Christian poems often directly reference the Bible, while others provide allegory. Supplemental arts. Christian art is art produced in an attempt to illustrate, supplement and portray in tangible form the principles of Christianity. Virtually all Christian groupings have used art to some extent. The prominence of art and the media, style, and representations change, however. The unifying theme is ultimately the representation of the life and times of Jesus and, in some cases, the Old Testament. Depictions of saints are also common, especially in Anglicanism, Roman Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy. Illumination. An illuminated manuscript is a manuscript in which the text is supplemented by the addition of decoration. The earliest surviving substantive illuminated manuscripts are from the period AD 400 to 600, primarily produced in Ireland, Constantinople and Italy. The majority of surviving manuscripts are from the Middle Ages, although many illuminated manuscripts survive from the 15th century Renaissance, along with a very limited number from late antiquity. Most illuminated manuscripts were created as codices, which had superseded scrolls. Some isolated single sheets survive. A very few illuminated manuscript fragments survive on papyrus. Most medieval manuscripts, illuminated or not, were written on parchment, but most manuscripts important enough to illuminate were written on the best quality of parchment, called vellum. traditionally made of unsplit calf skin, though high-quality parchment from other skins was also called parchment. Iconography. Christian art began about 2 centuries after Christ by borrowing motifs from Roman imperial imagery, classical Greek and Roman religion, and popular art. Religious images are used to some extent by the Abrahamic Christian faith, and often contain highly complex iconography, which reflects centuries of accumulated tradition. In the late antique period, iconography began to be standardized, and to relate more closely to biblical texts, although many gaps in the canonical gospel narratives were plugged with matter from the apocryphal gospels. Eventually the Church would succeed in weeding most of these out, but some remained, like the ox and ass in the Nativity of Christ. An icon is a religious work of art, most commonly a painting, from Eastern Christianity. Christianity has used symbolism from its very beginnings. In both East and West, numerous iconic types of Christ, Mary and saints and other subjects were developed. The number of named types of icons of Mary, with or without the infant Christ, was especially large in the East, whereas Christ Pantocrator was much the commonest image of Christ. Christian symbolism invests objects or actions with an inner meaning expressing Christian ideas. Christianity has borrowed from the common stock of significant symbols known to most periods and to all regions of the world. Religious symbolism is effective when it appeals to both the intellect and the emotions. Especially important depictions of Mary include the Hodegetria and Panagia types. Traditional models evolved for narrative paintings, including large cycles covering the events of the life of Christ, the life of the Virgin, parts of the Old Testament, and, increasingly, the lives of popular saints, especially in the West. A system of attributes developed for identifying individual figures of saints by a standard appearance and symbolic objects held by them. In the East, they were more likely to identified by text labels. Each saint has a story and a reason why he or she led an exemplary life. Symbols have been used to tell these stories throughout the history of the Church. A number of Christian saints are traditionally represented by a symbol or iconic motif associated with their life, termed an attribute or emblem, in order to identify them. The study of these forms part of iconography in art history. They were particularly architecture. Christian architecture encompasses a wide range of both secular and religious styles from the foundation of Christianity to the present day, influencing the design and construction of buildings and structures in Christian culture. Buildings were at first adapted from those originally intended for other purposes, but, with the rise of distinctively ecclesiastical architecture, church buildings came to influence secular ones, which have often imitated religious architecture. In the 20th century, the use of new materials, such as concrete, as well as simpler styles, has had its effect upon the design of churches, and arguably the flow of influence has been reversed. For the birth of Christianity to the present, the most significant period of transformation for Christian architecture in the West was the Gothic cathedral. In the East, Byzantine architecture was a continuation of Roman architecture. Philosophy. Christian philosophy is a term to describe the fusion of various fields of philosophy with the theological doctrines of Christianity. Scholasticism, which means that belongs to the school, and was a method of learning taught by the academics of medieval universities c. 1100 to 1500. Scholasticism originally started to reconcile the philosophy of the ancient classical philosophers with medieval Christian theology. Scholasticism is not a philosophy or theology in itself, but a tool in method for learning which places emphasis on dialectical reasoning.